It is my distinct pleasure to welcome uh, you all to this special occasion. I want to point out, first of all, that tonight is also special because this evening is in partnership with the JCC SF, the Jewish Community Center of San Francisco, a longtime partner with Reimagine, a space in physical proximity that I visited and admire and has been part of our work across the Bay Area. The JCC celebrates a vibrant city and its people. They explore Jewish culture and traditions as a pathway for joyful, meaningful living. They're a community for everyone, using the power of gathering together to share, inspire, support, and restore. And so special thanks this evening to Stephanie Singer, the JCC's Director of Arts and Ideas. What a title, Arts and Ideas. Love that. And now it is time. I'm going to bring up Andy, my colleague Andy on screen, who will be conducting this interview with the incredible Amy Bloom. Amy Bloom is an author, an educator, and a psychotherapist. She's had other jobs too. She's been a waitress, a bartender, an actor, and a peanut picker. Excited to learn about peanut picking. In her personal life, she's both a grandparent and a parent, and more recently, she's taken on the role of widow. Her most recent memoir, In Love, became an instant New York Times bestseller. It's a story of two people whose shared life experiences led them to find a courageous way to part. She's actually the author of 4 novels, 3 collections of short stories, a children's book, and numerous essays. And we are so grateful and humbled to have Amy with us this evening in conversation with Andy. Take it away, you two.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you for being here, Amy. It's great to meet you.
This is a lovely place to be right now.
As Brad mentioned, it's Dia de los Muertos. It's also All Souls Day. I also want to add that this month is National Family Caregivers Month. So it's really appropriate to have you here and to have Jacqueline Revere here as well, who will be speaking later in the program. There's a lot we're holding here. I've been reading in the chat, and I encourage others to do that, of loved ones who are suffering with illness, suffering with disease, mourning loved ones. And I have to add to that as well, I'm feeling some anticipatory anxiety over next week's elections and the future of how we'll all be able to control our bodies. And that brings us to your book, Amy. You know, when we start these interviews, we usually like to ask our guest speaker to describe the person that they're holding in their hearts tonight. It seems obvious that Brian is someone you'll be holding in your heart, but there may be others as well. Your therapist, who you write about in the book, Great Wayne, who is the professional who ultimately agreed to sign the letter supporting Brian's decision to end his life, said that Brian is, quote, a strong, determined man of mettle and courage. And for those who haven't read the book yet, maybe, Amy, you can elaborate a bit more about Brian. And I'm particularly curious about what brought the two of you together.
Let's see. Well, I can start at the end, that end first. I think what brought us together really was, as I say in the book, you know, we were both middle-aged Democrats in a mostly Republican small Connecticut town. So people actually assumed that we knew each other long before we did, because, you know, there's that big Italian guy and that short Jewish woman, and surely they must know each other. You know, after all, he's from Philadelphia, she's from New York. And I think we liked each other very much. I mean, we were friends for a long time. One of the things I used to say, both as a therapist and also just as a old person, is that you should choose the person you love for their faults, not necessarily for their strength, because everybody has faults. And it would be good if you preferred your partner's faults to other people's faults. And when Wayne described Brian as a strong man of mettle and courage, that was part of what I really admired about him. This was a guy who just ran towards everything. He just loved his life. He had never wanted to have children. He used to say when he married me, he felt like he had robbed a bank and everybody waved him out. He never had to have kids, and all of a sudden he had what we call the wolf pack. There's 4 granddaughters, and he ran towards everything. This is somebody who loved being a lot. He liked being himself, sometimes a lot, and he liked being alive, and he loved his life. He was a very physical person. So I think those are all the things. There are some people that you love and you got to help them cross the street every day. You got to go, here you go, it's all right, don't worry, little steps, we'll get there, you'll be safe. And there are some people they grab your hand and they drag you across the street as fast as they can. And that was more like Brian. And I didn't mind. I chose that.
And Amy, I mentioned that if there was someone else that you were holding in your heart tonight, feel free.
I think the other person I'm holding in my heart is really great Wayne, who passed away, almost exactly a year after Brian did. And part of there are many things I appreciated him for, but one of them was that it was clear to me, he was 87, it was clear to me that he was going to stay in practice long enough to see me through the worst of coming home and living my life. And he did, and we had our last session outside because he was also worried about COVID. And, it was actually exactly this time of year. And then he passed about 3 months later.
Thank you. I want to talk a bit about the origins of the book. You wrote that this was the most challenging book of your life. I think we can appreciate that. You've written about love before, in novels and short stories. And I know readers like myself appreciate your bravery in making the decision to write about the journey that you and Brian were on in the process of ending his life. And it's told with such honesty. You mentioned that, you described this experience as heartbreak. And I didn't really appreciate that word until I actually read this book. But I also want you to talk about the specific challenges of actually writing the book, those details.
Well, I think there were parts of it that were really helpful and parts of it that were just really hard to do. It turns out, happily, I guess, that you can cry and type at the same time. So that was really helpful. Also, I'm not a memoir writer. I think I've read 3 memoirs in my life, and I never would have written this except that Brian wanted me to. And in several interviews, people said, "Oh, your husband asked you to write this. That's so lovely." I said, "Well, you didn't know my husband. He told me. He said, 'Darling, you can do it. You're the writer. Write this book. People should know.'" And so that was really sort of part of the thread, not from the beginning of the process. Sometimes I was just taking notes, in the way that you do when you're a caregiver. 3 o'clock appointment, 5 o'clock, go to the pharmacy, 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, give Brian a ride to the gym. All of those things. And so that was, a lot of my notes were not literary notes by any means. They were just the notebook that every caregiver has. What has been done, what needs to be done, what will need to be done soon.
So you kept these notes, but when Brian gave you the directive to write, were you actively journaling all of this down, these feelings, these expressions?
No, I would write down sometimes if there was a particularly complicated or terrible and really funny event. I mean, when we found ourselves in the Hallmark greeting card section, and Brian was looking for note cards because he wanted to leave a little note for everybody in the family, I did go home and write that down because it was really moving and really great, and also really funny, at least to me and to Brian. So that, I had the page, I actually, there it is. There's the notebook that all the notes are in. Then later on, I think one of the most extraordinary things that happened to me is when I got back from Zurich, airports were already starting to close in Europe. Just a few here and there. You were just beginning to hear the beginning of the pandemic. And within a couple of weeks, my youngest daughter, who lives in Brooklyn with her wife and their little girl, called me and she said, "Mommy, I don't know what to do. We both have to work full time from home and you cannot get a babysitter. All the daycare centers are closed. I don't know what to do." And I said, "Well, get in your little car and come on up." And that's what we did for the next 6 months. And I think that really helped me write the book, because I think there's a Diane Ackerman poem and she talks about the tree that falls in the forest and it lies on the forest floor and it's a dead log. But in fact, grass and flowers grow in the dead log. And that's really how it felt to me to have them come and live with me. It's not what I expected. It's not what I thought I wanted. But I think that's part of what made it possible for me to write the book, maybe sooner than I would have been able to if I had just been on my own.
Thank you. You mentioned Zurich. I think for those folks who may not have read the book, this might be the right time to talk about why you went to Zurich and what do we know about Switzerland vis-a-vis other countries in the world to take care of our bodies.
Well, I guess we could start with the fact that they really do have excellent chocolate. It's not just a rumor. But the reason we went to Zurich was that when Brian was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, or as they tend to say in neurologists' office, probably Alzheimer's. I mean, what they really know is that you have a dementing disease. They don't always know exactly what the disease is. And that he had probably had it for several years, which seemed likely to me. It was a terrible, terrible diagnosis to receive, but it's also like when you are in a car and you see another car heading right towards you. It is shocking and terrible, but in some way you're not surprised because you see the car coming. And that's sort of how the diagnosis felt to us. And I would say within 48 hours, Brian, who I should say was a football player when he was in college, and in fact played football from the time he was 7 until he was 22, said, "The long goodbye is not for me. You know how I am. I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees. And let's research this." And I knew, because we'd been together for 15 years, that what he meant by "let's research this" is you go research this and come back and report. And after about a week, what I found was that if you have a dementing disease in the United States, the right to die states, the 10 states and District of Columbia, are of no help at all, because the rules are either two doctors will attest that you have no more than 6 months to live. Well, of course, if you have a dementing disease, by the time you have 6 months left to live, a great deal of your cognitive function and yourself has already left your body. And therefore you are not in a position to give informed consent or discernment or write an essay or go through the 2 required interviews. So what we found was Dignitas, which is a nonprofit organization in Switzerland. There are now actually 2 of them, which is extraordinary to me. It's like this idea that there is a Macy's and a Gimbel's in this field is extraordinary to me. But there they are. They're both in the suburbs of Zurich. They're run by people who know each other and have worked together. So there's Dignitas and there's Pegasus. And they are available for what they describe as accompanied suicide, which is if you meet their criteria, which is that you do not have an underlying clinical depression or other mental illness, and you are capable of showing that you have made a thoughtful decision about this, and that the person or persons who are helping you have no financial interest in you ending your life, so there's no other motives. They will help you end your life in a way that is legal, peaceful, and painless. And it is wonderful that they exist. It is also really, to me, shocking and a terrible indictment of our healthcare system that that is the only place in the world that that's available to an American citizen.
Amy, that term accompanied suicide, after I read your book, that was the first time I heard that expression. You know, most of us, if we know about medical aid in dying, we hear assisted suicide. You're someone who cares about words. You're good at words. Can you tell us why Dignitas uses that language?
Well, as you can imagine, I didn't feel that it was my place to suddenly start questioning them about the language they use in their website. I felt like, that's what you want to call it. That's what you want to call it. But having been there, I think that the way they see it and the way that they wish for people to understand it, that they are there with you with the journey. I mean, they provide the space. There's an apartment in the suburbs. There are always a couple of volunteers to meet you, to sit with you, to be helpful in the most tactful way possible. But they are not terribly active. You know, it is upon the person who makes this decision to say, I am ready. It is on the person who makes the decision to take the sodium pentobarbital, and they are there to be companions, but they are not there to lead or direct. And they will say to you, with no exaggeration, a dozen times or 20 times in that period of time, are you sure this is what you would like to do? If you wish to change your mind at any time, please let us know.
Going back to this issue with medical aid in dying, you know, it's a cultural taboo. And for someone who's seriously ill and for their loved ones, you know, society tells us you're supposed to carry on, you're supposed to cope, you're supposed to persevere. And if you're a doctor, your job is to fix everything. To find a solution. And I'm curious, besides this, what other taboos do you think remain strong in our culture?
Oh, well, I suppose it depends on which corner of the culture you live in. Every group, every subgroup, every culture has their own taboos, but this is a big one. It seems to me across a lot of cultural lines, which is, first of all, people don't want to talk about it, which I understand. I had an email actually the other day from a palliative care doctor who said, I am leaving 5 copies of your book in my waiting room. It's such a difficult conversation to start with people. I'm just leaving the book there in hopes that my older patients will come in and take a look and it will start a conversation. I also understand it. I mean, Brian was an exceptional person and a very brave person and not much for taboos. He used to say that he left the Catholic Church for the Doors when he was 14 years old. So he was not much given to taboos or keeping his mouth shut. Also, as makes sense to me, he had been a volunteer at Planned Parenthood since he was 19 years old. And I think for him, choice was choice. The idea, I mean, for him, what right to life meant was that you have a right to have agency and autonomy in your life, and you have a right to have agency and autonomy in your death, if that is possible. And so I know that this had always been an issue for him, and that's part of why he wanted me to write about it, because, you know, periodically when we ran into roadblocks, he would say, I don't understand who thinks this is not my life?
And Amy, growing up, what would you say the strongest taboos were that you broke?
Oh, that I broke? Well, I was sort of the stealth assassin in my family. I had seen my big sister get into a lot of trouble, and I thought that the trouble seemed like a great idea, but the getting caught did not. And so I think I mostly learned to keep my mouth shut and accomplish my goals. But also, and the real taboo, certainly in my family, people never spoke about illness. I mean, I remember finding out that my mother had had a hysterectomy because I got a phone call from my father, which was in itself a shocking experience. And then he said, I just want to let you know, mommy's fine. I was like, where is she? He said, she's fine. Since, I was now 35 years old and had never had a phone conversation with my father. And he said, oh, well, she had a hysterectomy. She didn't want to worry you. Everything's fine. Bye. And there you have it. So illness was not a subject. The past was not a subject. And certainly death and dying was not a subject. And I understand this. I mean, I had to chase my own parents around a very small house for several hours to get them to sign sort of a list of advanced directives when they were much older people. Because, I mean, I would walk into the kitchen, my dad would walk out, I'd walk into the bedroom, my mother would say, oh, I just have to go wash my hair. And I chased them for like 7 hours. So it's not that I think, oh, I can't imagine why people find this hard to talk about. It's terrible to talk about. It's like when you have a conversation with somebody in your family and they go, well, if Uncle Joe dies. I'm like, if? The man's 93 years old. Like, what do you know that I don't know if Uncle Joe dies? But I think that's how hard it is to put your mouth around it.
So you mentioned advanced directives, so I'm going to skip over to my question on that. 1 month before going to Switzerland, you and Brian discussed plans for his memorial service. I'm curious if you had any discussions with Brian about end-of-life planning before the Alzheimer's diagnosis.
We both had sort of a very standard, I think inadequate now is what I think, advanced directives: do not resuscitate, no intubation. If we are unlikely to be able to continue as we had been, we would want no treatment, just palliative care. But part of what was also clear to both of us, I had sat with both of my parents at their deathbeds and was able to bring them home, is that it was so important that we were home. Because once your loved one or yourself is in an institution, other people are making the interpretation and other people are making the decisions. And even if they are the most well-meaning people in the world, they have other obligations and other inclinations. And you are not going to be able to control those things.
And I'm curious about yourself, since Brian made his decision, were there any changes to your own planning?
I think that it became more clear to me, partially, when Brian told me, I had said to him, you don't have to do that. You can stay home. I will take care of you. You will be home as long as I can keep you home, and I will love you and I will protect you and look after you. And he said to me, you're not hearing me. This is not what I want to do. He said, when I die, I would like people to miss me rather than be relieved. And I don't know if I feel that way about the miss me rather than be relieved part, but I have spent a lot of time in hospitals, and I certainly personally have no wish to live as long as possible, regardless of the circumstances. That is not something that brightens my heart. The idea of a long life with joy and purpose that ends when I am still with this world is fine with me.
Let's move on to care for caregivers. I think there are a lot of them here on this call right now. You know, we still stumble when we're figuring out how to show up for our friends who are going through a hard time. Maybe you can give us some examples of the best kind of support that you got.
I'd be happy to. I was very lucky, I think, in many ways. Also, part of what I made a decision about was to do my best, except in the circumstances where I feel people were actually intentionally or unintentionally doing Brian harm. I felt the best path for me was forgiveness. Everybody messes up. Everybody puts their foot in it. Everybody says the wrong thing. Everybody calls you by your sister's name or forgets how old somebody is or forgets that you're allergic to cheese or whatever it is. Everybody messes up. That's how you can tell that we're human beings. It's not optional. So I felt that the best care that I could give myself was to be forgiving and also to avoid people who were making me crazy. I didn't feel that I owed that to them. You know, Brian had an old friend who would regularly send us emails after Brian had made this decision saying, I Googled Alzheimer's. It doesn't seem that bad. I'm like, thank you. Or my Uncle Joe has Alzheimer's and we had a family party and he had a great time. So maybe you should rethink your decision. And I thought, I'm not going to write back what I'd like to write back because, you know, I'm working on my soul. On the other hand, I don't feel like we need to engage in this conversation any longer. And Brian dictated an email to me, which was absolutely loving and very clear and said, we are here to receive encouragement and loving support. And that's all. Anything else you should share with somebody else. And I found that actually a very useful approach, which is to say, I am not the right person for you to share this with. If this is your feeling about it, please share it with somebody else in your life, but not with me. Also, I'm very big on gardening. I'm very big on cooking, and I'm very big on spending some time, often actively if you can, but there's nothing wrong with passively. That's what Netflix is for. You know, doing things that give you a little break, that make you feel a little better. I cannot tell you how much mindless television, but good-natured mindless television, because that's sort of my jam, I watched during Brian's illness and in the months afterwards. I watched television shows that I actually think are so mindless, they should probably be banned from television. And nevertheless, they were my comfort every night between 2 and 5 a.m. because I was never asleep between 2 and 5.
Amy, now I'd like you to share an example of less than stellar support from medical professionals in particular. You know, this section that I'm asked you to prepare is but one of your many efforts to provide Dignitas with the doctor's letter, which is a requirement to attest that the client has no evidence of clinical depression. Give us a read, please.
Sure. One of the things I say in this book is that when I write fiction, there are never any villains because I think people are complicated. And I understand that his neurologist and his psychiatrist were not, in fact, villains, but they are certainly not the heroes of his particular story. So because the neurologist messes up, basically, and writes that the reason for the MRI is that he has suffered from clinical depression, which was not the case, we have to try to undo that. Oh, I see that I think I can do equally well without the lights in my eyes. This is Brian's psychiatrist, who he was meeting with at this point, really to start manage his feelings about the end of his life and the illness. What will be our only meeting? The psychiatrist cannot conceal her distress when we tell her that having understood the diagnosis and the MRI, Brian and I are looking at Dignitas. As often happened with relatives and healthcare providers, a vacation, a final trip to Ravenna or Telluride, or perhaps marlin fishing in the Keys is suggested. I know that even if they have not watched the 10,000 YouTube videos on Alzheimer's and its progression, medical professionals do know that no one can predict how quickly or slowly Brian's particular case will progress. Whether you are medical personnel, clergy, worried child, or hopeful spouse, you do know, even if you never say so, that this disease progresses as steady as winter. And the person who is still smiling, that crooked, loving smile this year, even as they are unsure about location, histories, appointments, and bills, will be unable to truly converse with meaning or engage in a relationship in a couple of years, and will be unable to walk or smile in recognition in 10 years. And what you will end up hoping, as a close friend of mine whose beloved got Alzheimer's at 50 and lived to be 70, told me, you hope that your beloved forgets how to swallow. I asked the psychiatrist to write a letter for us for Dignitas, just in case we need it, stating that Brian is of sound mind and understands his decision. Brian explains to the psychiatrist that he needs to be high functioning cognitively to arrange for an assisted suicide. We call it assisted because we have not yet gotten used to the Dignitas phrase accompanied suicide, which does sound to me as if an orchestra will be standing by. It seems quite clear to me that Brian is, of course, of sound mind, and he does understand the decision. The psychiatrist doesn't argue or even address the subject of his state of mind at all. She does say, hand to anxious mouth, do I have to answer that question now? And I back off. I say that she does not have to answer now, but that she will have to answer soon because we will be asking her for that letter soon. All three of us fall silent, and then she leaps up out of her seat with Maria von Trapp-like enthusiasm, telling us that we should plan for good times and we should seek out joyful activities. And she lifts her hands over her head. She mentions European vacations, trips to beautiful lakes. She says the word joy several times. And Brian and I stare at her. We want joy. We do. We really do. And neither of us thinks that 8 years of a steady decline and complete loss of self for him sounds like joy. When we get home, Brian says, I don't think this will work out. She's not on our team. I agree. Brian breaks up with the psychiatrist by text. Over the next few days, she texts him trying to get him to come to her office for closure. I get it. I might have done the same thing. I don't want Brian to go see this person because I'm afraid she will upset or confuse him with more talk and brochures of river barge holidays or a cure in his lifetime. Even on the Alzheimer's websites, the most encouraging news lately is phone apps to help you organize or find the Alzheimer's patients, and all the recent major failed clinical trials are described as very helpful in the fight against Alzheimer's. I suppose the psychiatrist might get Brian to change his mind, which would be all right, but I doubt it. I don't think I could get him to change his mind. He feels bad for the psychiatrist. He says, I see I've upset her, which inclines him to go and see her. And then he goes out for a walk and he comes back and says, no, not on our team.
I wish everyone had great team members like Great Wayne.
Me too.
This is a shameless plug for an upcoming program that we have this month as part of our virtual programming. There's a workshop coming up led by a filmmaker named Judith Helfand, and it's taking place a few days before Thanksgiving. She has a documentary called Love and Stuff, and it's streaming now on PBS if anyone's curious to take a look. And she was filming her mother, who really wanted to have conversations with Judith about all the stuff in her home. Who should have this tchotchke? Who should have, what should we toss? What should we donate? And you and Brian had stuff. And you mentioned specifically the dozens of navy blue notebooks that you used to communicate with one another. And you wrote that you still kept them when writing the book. Maybe you can tell us more about the importance of these notebooks.
Well, the notebooks had a couple of iterations. I mean, they started really just because, as is the case in some marriages, you know, some people are more the managers and some people are more something else, and I was more the manager, like, oh, we are going to dinner on Saturday night, or your mother called. And so they were mostly just because they were larger, better than a scrap of paper under the salt shaker. But later in our life together, and certainly in those last 3 years before his death, they really came to be such organizing forces. You know, I would write the day and the date at the top of every page, so that every day there was a little list, either things that he needed to do, or things that I wanted to remind him of, or things that he would say to me. You know, went to stained glass studio, because he was working on a stained glass piece. And as he became more ill and more symptomatic, you know, I could see, not that I wanted to see, but I could see that the pages became more concrete and more specific. There were no jokes, there were no references to other things. It was just 9 a.m., get ready to go to doctor's appointment, you know, 11 o'clock, whatever it is, and directions written down, and reminders that my son-in-law was taking him to the gym. He wasn't going to be driving to the gym, all those kinds of things. And I say, I don't know a caregiver who doesn't have at least one notebook or one list or one pad of paper just to keep track of everything that's happening. And as a way, I think, for those of us who are doing the caregiving, of feeling that things are just not spinning wildly beyond gravity, just to feel like you can at least manage to get bananas.
And in terms of other stuff, I'm thinking about intangible gifts that Brian gave you. Could you name a few of those?
Well, one of the things I just thought was amazing about him is that he was just game. He was just willing. And so, you know, if I had said to Brian, oh, honey, there is a drag queen mermaid contest in Coney Island in 3 hours, he would say, let me get my hat. And it's a great, great quality. And I think of myself as sort of, you know, reasonably adventurous and so on, but there was nothing like it for him. And we used to say he was a hard man to stop. And I think one of the other things that he really gave me, I don't abide by all of his principles, but his first principle was take yes for an answer. Something I think is actually particularly hard for nice people, which is that somebody, you know, you say to somebody, could I have X? And they go, yes. And you go, well, you know, if it's too much trouble, or if I'm putting you out, or if it's inconvenient. Brian had none of that. You said yes to Brian, he took it out of your hand. And I thought that was a great quality. He also used to say, as a lapsed Catholic, better to ask forgiveness than permission, something I have heard frequently from my friends who are Catholic. And he would say, if there's going to be a fight, you don't want there to be a fight, throw the first punch. And that is very much how he felt about Alzheimer's. He understood he was going to be outmanned and outgunned, and he was not going to be there for that. He was going to make this decision in his framework and to the best of his ability, under his agency.
Amy, you've done a lot of these talks about the book already, and I'm curious, have these conversations made you think differently about your own mortality?
You know, this might be one of those things that I come to see later that it did. It doesn't feel that way to me now. I think I am all right with the idea of my mortality. I think what I care the most about is how I live my life. The idea that it does not somehow magically go on forever in this form is, I'm all right with that too. I feel like maybe what all of this has done for me is just a stronger sense of the pairing of grief and gratitude. that you do not have love without grief. And part of that then is to recognize how lucky you have been to have what you had.
Yes. I think we need to wrap up, Amy. I'm so sorry, but could you end with reading your wedding vows?
I can. Brian takes my hands and I cannot see anything except his face. He says, I prepared some, and then he squeezes my hands tightly and he begins to cry. I love you so much, he says. That's all I can say. I will love you every day of my life. And then he says quietly, your turn. And I say, middle-aged women are supposed to look for the safe harbor, for the port in the storm of life. We are supposed to look for the calm and the comfortable. You are the port in the storm, and you are the storm, and you are the sea, and you are the rocks and the beach and the waves, and you are the sunrise and the sunset and all of the light in between. I think I have more to say, but I can't. We are holding hands, pressed against each other, holding each other up. I whisper to him, every day of my life, and he whispers to me, every day of my life.
Thank you, Amy Bloom.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be with everybody. I wish you a very good evening.
Oh, wow. Amy, thank you so much for joining us. And I before you leave the screen here and we move on to the next section of the program, I typically like to write a little poem for some of our guests, and I wrote one for you. They're 15 syllables long. That's all it is. I'll place it in the chat and read it to you. But based on this exquisite conversation you and Andy just had. So 15 syllables, 5 lines, 3 syllables each. Courage is a choice we make when things are hard. You choose the heart.
Thank you. I'm going to take that with me. Thank you all very much, and good night to everybody.